that you dare to dream.
I held my breath. I couldn't speak because he scared me half to death.
That's something that people have gotten wrong about your mom, that she really was funny all the time. She was not.
Oh, yeah, but she wasn't tragic. That's the thing that bugs me the most.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And say, tragic Judy Garland. I want to say, shut up.
What happened to Judy Garland's 3 children will leave you speechless. While the world mourned the loss of the greatest entertainer who ever lived, nobody stopped to ask what happened to the kids she left behind.
Judy Garland spent her life singing about bluebirds, but she died without ever finding them. She was found dead on the bathroom floor early Sunday morning.
Liza, Lorna, and Joey were handed a life nobody would wish on anyone. Abandoned by an industry that destroyed their mother, robbed of a normal childhood, and forced to carry a legacy built on tragedy. 3 children grew up knowing that their mother was one of the most famous people on the planet. They watched her perform on stages that seated thousands of people. They saw her face on magazine covers and her name on theatre marquees. And then, when the youngest of them was just 13 years old, she was gone.
When you're a child, you never see your parent as a child. So when I first saw The Wizard of Oz, it was very, very difficult for me to understand that that was my mother. And we watched The Wizard of Oz without her. And I proceeded to get so hysterical and so scared, and I was crying, and I was a wreck.
Judy Garland died in June 1969 at the age of 47, and the 3 children she left behind, Liza, Lorna, and Joey, were suddenly on their own, in a world that had always paid more attention to their mother than it had to them. Their story is one that tends to get left out of the telling. But before we can get to them, we have to start at the beginning, because nothing about what happened to those children can be properly understood without first understanding what happened to their mother, and what happened to their mother started long before most people realize. She was born Frances Ethel Gumm on the 10th of June, 1922, in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. The house she came into the world in still stands today on South Pokegama Avenue, a 2-story white clapboard building that looks exactly like what it was, the home of a modest, respectable, middle-class family in a modest, respectable, middle-class neighborhood. Her father, Frank Gumm, managed a local movie theater. Her mother, Ethel, was the kind of person who treated ambition less like a choice and more like a survival strategy. Together they had 3 daughters, and together they supplemented the family income by performing in vaudeville, a form of variety entertainment that was already well past its peak by the time Frances arrived as the youngest of the 3. What happened next is the kind of thing that tends to get told as a charming story. And in some ways, it was. Frances was somewhere around 2 years old when she first stood on a stage at her father's theater and sang Jingle Bells in front of an audience. According to people who were there that evening, the room went quiet in a way that rooms do not usually go quiet for 2-year-olds. There was something about the way she performed, some quality that had no real business being present in someone so young, that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention. It was the kind of moment that sets a life on a particular path, and this one was no exception. The Gumm family's finances were never entirely stable, and the performances of their daughters were part of how they kept things going. Frances and her 2 older sisters, Mary Jane and Dorothy Virginia, became a traveling act known as the Gumm Sisters, moving along the vaudeville circuit in a second-hand car, staying in boarding houses, performing wherever they could get a booking. It was Ethel who drove all of this. She sewed the matching costumes herself, managed the bookings, and pushed the act forward with an intensity that several biographers over the years have struggled to describe as anything other than obsessive. Whether that intensity came from genuine belief in her daughter's talent, from financial desperation, or from something more complicated is difficult to say with certainty. Probably it was all 3 at once. In 1926, when Frances was 4 years old, the family left Minnesota and moved to Lancaster, California. The reasons for the move have never been entirely clear, though biographers have noted that Frank Gumm's personal life had generated the kind of small-town talk that tends to make staying in a small town uncomfortable. Whatever the precise reasons, the family went west, bought another theatre with borrowed money, and continued building a life around performance. Frances regularly appeared between film screenings at her father's venue, standing on a wooden box so that the audience could see her over the top of the stage. People began coming specifically because they had heard about the youngest Gumm girl. By the time Frances was 10 years old, her days followed a pattern that would have been exhausting for an adult. Voice lessons in the morning, dance classes in the afternoon, rehearsals and performances in the evening. It was around this age, according to biographical research based on accounts from people who knew the family, that Ethel began giving her daughter what were referred to at the time as pep pills, obtained from a local pharmacist. The intention was to help Frances maintain her energy through the demands of her schedule. The consequence, which either Ethel did not fully understand or chose not to examine too carefully, was that she was starting her youngest daughter down a road of chemical dependency that would follow Frances for the rest of her life. She was 10 years old. There was no ordinary childhood happening alongside any of this. Frances did not have the experience of coming home from school, finishing homework, and spending a free evening doing whatever she liked. The stage was the center of her world, and in some respects it gave her something that the rest of her life did not. On stage, she was wanted. She was admired. She mattered. Off stage, according to a number of accounts from people who knew her during this period, she felt considerably less certain of her own value. Some biographers have drawn attention to a detail from this period of her life, namely that Ethel had apparently considered not going through with the pregnancy before Frances was born, and have suggested that Frances may have become aware of this at some point during her childhood. Whether or not that is accurate, the pattern it would help explain is one that shows up clearly throughout her later life. A person who felt most secure and most valued when she was performing, and most uncertain of herself when she was not. The turn that changed everything came in 1935. Frances was 13 years old when a songwriter named Burton Lane, who had been sent by Louis B., mayor of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, to watch her perform at the Orpheum Theatre, saw her on stage and came away convinced that she needed to be in front of a camera. Her audition for the studio followed shortly after. She sang 2 songs. That was enough. MGM offered her a contract. For the Gumm family, this must have felt like the moment that all of it had been building towards. The years on the road, the boarding houses, the hand-sewn costumes, the punishing schedules, all of it had led here. Frances Gumm was going to become a movie star. The studio gave her a new name almost immediately. Judy Garland, taken loosely from a Hoagy Carmichael song, was the identity they constructed for her, and it replaced Frances Gumm so thoroughly that within a few years it was difficult for many people to remember that she had ever been called anything else. She was 13 years old, she had spent more than a decade of her short life performing professionally, and she was now the property of one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood. The man at the top of that studio, Louis B. Mayer, recognized her talent immediately. What is equally well documented is that he recognized something else in her, a deep and genuine need for approval, a vulnerability that had been shaped by years of performing for audiences and of feeling most valued when she was giving people what they wanted to see. Mayer understood what that vulnerability meant in practical terms. It meant she would be easier to manage than a performer who was more confident, or one who had more options available to her. What the Gumm family almost certainly did not fully appreciate, as they looked at the contract being placed in front of them, was that opportunity and exploitation are not always opposites. Sometimes they arrive in the same envelope. The girl who walked onto the MGM lot in the autumn of 1935 was about to become one of the most famous performers in the world. She was also about to enter a system that had very little genuine interest in her well-being, and a very clear interest in getting as much as possible out of her talent for as long as it held out. For Frances Ethel Gumm, born in a white clapboard house in Minnesota, to a family that lived and breathed the stage, that tension between the extraordinary gift she had been given and the cost of sharing it with the world would turn out to be the defining fact of her entire life. The contract was signed, the name was changed, and the machinery of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer began doing what it did best. It took raw material and turned it into a product. In Judy Garland's case, the raw material was extraordinary, and the product it became was one of the most celebrated in Hollywood history. But the process of that transformation, the specific things that were done to her, and the specific conditions under which she was required to work, is a story that deserves to be looked at directly rather than glossed over. Because what happened to Judy Garland at MGM was not simply the pressure of a demanding industry applied to a sensitive person. It was a sustained and deliberate set of practices carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and it left marks that never healed. Louis B. Mayer ran MGM with a degree of authority that is difficult to fully appreciate today. He was not simply a studio executive in the way we might think of one now. He was the central figure in a system that controlled almost every aspect of the lives of the people who worked within it, and he exercised that control with a combination of charm, calculation, and occasional cruelty that kept those around him uncertain of where they stood. With Judy Garland, he adopted an approach that biographers have returned to again and again because of how precisely it seemed designed to exploit the specific weaknesses she had arrived with. He positioned himself as a father figure to her, and the timing of that positioning was not coincidental. Her own father, Frank Gumm, died in 1935, the same year she joined the studio, leaving a gap in her life that Mayer appears to have understood and been willing to use. The way this played out in practice was a pattern of alternating warmth and humiliation. When Garland performed well, Mayer was reportedly generous with his praise, effusive in a way that made her feel seen and valued. When her appearance or her behavior fell short of his expectations, the criticism that followed was personal and sharp. He reportedly referred to her, in private, as his little hunchback. On other occasions, he called her a fat little pig with pigtails. These were not passing remarks made carelessly. They were part of a consistent approach that communicated to her, repeatedly and from a position of enormous authority, that her natural self was somehow not good enough, that without the studio's management and intervention she was inadequate. The fact that these messages came from the man who also told her she was wonderful, the man who had stepped into the space left by her father's death, made them considerably more damaging than they might otherwise have been. The studio's management of her body began almost immediately. She was placed on a severe dietary regimen, with her daily food intake restricted during filming periods to little more than chicken soup and black coffee, while the actors around her ate normally. When she was caught eating something outside her approved portions at the studio canteen, the response from studio personnel was immediate and humiliating. Garland spoke about these experiences in later years, describing how food would be removed from in front of her while her colleagues looked on. The effect on her relationship with her own body was lasting. The insecurities that were planted during those early years at the studio stayed with her for the rest of her life. To keep her working through schedules that regularly stretched to 18 hours a day, the studio supplied her with amphetamines. These were not drugs she sought out herself. They were provided by doctors who were employed by MGM, whose professional responsibility was first and foremost to the studio, rather than to the health of its performers. The amphetamines suppressed her appetite and gave her the energy to keep going through the relentless demands of production. When the amphetamines made it impossible for her to sleep, she was given sedatives, uppers to get through the day, sleeping pills to get through the night. This was not a pattern she stumbled into by accident. It was a routine that the studio created, maintained, and monitored. She was a teenager when it started. She was 13, then 14, then 15, and the cycle continued. When she was cast as Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz, she was 16 years old. The film would go on to become one of the most beloved in cinema history, and her performance at its center remains, by almost any measure, one of the most remarkable things ever captured on screen. Her rendition of Over the Rainbow, delivered with a simplicity and a sincerity that had no business belonging to someone so young, became the defining moment of her career and one of the most celebrated performances in American film. But even around the making of that film, the studio's priorities were visible in ways that are uncomfortable to look at now. Mayer had initially attempted to borrow Shirley Temple from another studio for the role, and when Garland was confirmed as the lead, the studio fitted her with special undergarments, designed to flatten and conceal her developing figure. The costume she wore, the blue gingham dress that became one of the most iconic in film history, was chosen in part because it minimized her body. The message being communicated to her through these decisions, on top of everything else, was that her physical self, in its natural state, was something to be managed, minimized, and, if possible, hidden. The years that followed The Wizard of Oz brought further successes that confirmed she was not simply a child star who had got lucky with one role. Meet Me in Saint Louis in 1944, directed by Vincente Minnelli, who would later become her second husband, showed a depth and maturity that silenced anyone who still had doubts about her range. The film was a significant commercial and critical success, and Garland's performance in it demonstrated that she was capable of something far more nuanced than the wide-eyed wonder she had brought to Dorothy. She was developing into one of the most genuinely gifted performers of her generation, and the studio knew it. The problem was that the conditions under which she was being required to develop were making it increasingly difficult for her to sustain what was being asked of her. By the mid-1940s, the cracks were becoming harder to ignore. Years of chemical dependency, combined with the psychological toll of the control being exercised over her and the relentless pressure of the schedule she was being kept to, had accumulated in ways that were beginning to affect her ability to work consistently. In July 1947, it became public knowledge that Garland had attempted to take her own life. It was a moment that, by any reasonable measure, should have prompted serious reflection on the part of the studio about the conditions it had created and the role it had played in bringing things to that point. Instead, MGM managed the story through its publicity department and largely continued as before, maintaining pressure on their star to keep producing. The following year, she was suspended during the production of The Barclays of Broadway due to her frequent absences and her deteriorating emotional state. She was replaced by Ginger Rogers. In 1949, during the filming of Annie Get Your Gun, her behavior on set became increasingly erratic, and after a series of disruptions that caused considerable delays, MGM removed her from the production entirely and reshot her scenes with Betty Hutton at significant expense. The studio's tolerance, such as it had ever genuinely been, was running low. In 1950, she was cast in Royal Wedding, but it became clear early in production that she could no longer sustain what was being demanded of her. MGM terminated her contract in September of that year. She was 28 years old. She had been under the studio's control for 15 of them. Having arrived as a 13-year-old girl with exceptional talent and a deep need for approval, and leaving as a young woman, carrying both the extraordinary gifts that had made her famous and the considerable damage that the system had done to her along the way. What is important to understand about what MGM did to Judy Garland is that none of it happened by accident. The dietary restrictions, the pills, the psychological manipulation, the management of her body and her schedule and her social world, these were not oversights or the unintended consequences of a busy studio trying to keep up with production demands. They were choices, made deliberately by people in positions of authority who understood what they were doing. The studio had 5 doctors assigned specifically to oversee her weight and 3 full-time handlers to manage her schedule. This was not neglect. It was active and organized control of a human being who had been identified as a valuable commercial asset and was being managed accordingly. The broader context matters here as well. Garland's experience was an extreme case, but it was not an entirely isolated one. The studio system of the 1930s and 1940s operated on terms that were frequently harsh to the individuals caught within it, and particularly to those who had entered it young. The mechanisms used on Garland, the chemical management, the physical monitoring, the psychological pressure, were reflections of an industry-wide set of priorities that placed commercial output above almost everything else. What made her case distinctive was not that these things happened to her, but the degree to which they happened and the specific vulnerability she had arrived with that made their impact so deep and so lasting. By the time she walked off the MGM lot for the last time in 1950, the 2 things that would define the rest of her life were already fully formed. One was a talent so genuine and so powerful that it would continue to move audiences for the remaining 19 years of her life and long after. The other was a set of wounds, physical, psychological, and emotional, that she would spend those 19 years trying to find a way to live with. The studio had given her both. It had made her famous, and in doing so it had also, through the specific choices it made along the way, played a very significant role in making her life extraordinarily difficult. Those two facts are not separable. They are part of the same story, told by the same institution, at the expense of the same person. When MGM terminated her contract in 1950, the general assumption among many people in the industry was that Judy Garland's story was essentially over. She was 28 years old. She had a well-documented dependency on prescription medication, and the studio that had built her career had decided she was no longer worth the trouble. In Hollywood, that combination of circumstances tended to mean one thing. But Judy Garland had never been particularly easy to predict, and what happened next was not what most people were expecting. In 1951, she opened at the Palace Theatre in New York. The Palace carried significant weight in the world of live performance, the kind of venue where a successful run meant something beyond the run itself. What the audiences who came to see her found was not a diminished version of the star they remembered from her MGM years. They found something considerably more interesting than that. The experiences she had been through, the pressure, the loss, the years of being managed and controlled and pushed beyond what any person should reasonably be pushed, had done something to her voice and to her presence on stage that could not have been manufactured or rehearsed. There was a rawness to her now, a quality that came directly from having lived through what she had lived through, and it created a connection with the people watching her that went beyond ordinary entertainment. The run at the Palace was extended again and again. It became an event. The decade that followed was defined by this kind of live performance, and it produced what many people who were present for it still regard as some of the most extraordinary concerts they ever witnessed. The pinnacle came on the 23rd of April 1961 at Carnegie Hall in New York City. The recording made that evening, released as Judy at Carnegie Hall, spent 73 weeks on the Billboard charts, 13 of them at number 1, and won 5 Grammy Awards. Music historians and critics have returned to it repeatedly in the years since, and the consensus has remained remarkably consistent. It is one of the greatest live recordings ever made. Whatever the difficulties of her personal life, whatever the ongoing challenges she faced, on that stage on that evening she was operating at a level that very few performers in any era have managed to reach. Her personal life during these years was complicated in ways that were often very public. She married 5 times in total. Her first marriage, to musician David Rose, ended in divorce in 1944. Her second, to director Vincente Minnelli, produced her daughter Liza and lasted until 1951. Her third husband was producer Sid Luft, with whom she had 2 more children, Lorna and Joey, and that marriage ended in 1965, after more than a decade together. Marriages to actor Mark Herron and then to nightclub manager Mickey Deans followed. Each relationship ended in divorce, and the pattern across all of them reflected in various ways the same difficulties that had followed her since her teenage years, the dependency on substances, the financial instability, and the deep uncertainty about her own worth that no amount of audience adoration had ever quite managed to resolve. Her television series, which ran for 26 episodes between 1963 and 1964, demonstrated both how remarkable she remained as a performer and how difficult consistency had become for her. There were episodes that reminded viewers exactly why she was considered one of the finest entertainers of her generation. There were also episodes that showed the strain she was under. The series was cancelled after 1 season, and it was another chapter in a career that had never followed a simple or predictable line. By the late 1960s, she was living in London with Mickey Deans, her 5th husband. Her performances during this period were unpredictable, in the way that her performances had been unpredictable for some time by then. Some nights she was extraordinary. Other nights she struggled to get through a set, and the audiences who had come hoping to see the performer they remembered sometimes left disappointed. On the 22nd of June 1969, she was found dead at the rented house in Chelsea where she and Deans had been staying. She was 47 years old. The coroner's conclusion was an accidental overdose of barbiturates, the same category of drugs she had first been given as a teenager on the MGM lot more than 3 decades earlier. The response to her death was enormous and immediate. Approximately 20,000 people filed past her coffin at the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Home in Manhattan. James Mason, who had appeared alongside her in A Star is Born in 1954, delivered a eulogy that spoke to both her talent and her humanity with a directness that captured what a great many people were feeling. The world mourned not simply a great entertainer, but a person whose story had always contained within it a particular kind of sorrow that people had recognized and responded to without always being able to say exactly why. Part of the answer to that question lies in the connection that developed between Garland and LGBTQ+ communities during her lifetime, a connection that deepened further after her death and has never really faded. The phrase "friend of Dorothy," used as coded language during years when openly identifying as gay or lesbian carried serious social and, in some cases, legal consequences, linked her famous role in The Wizard of Oz to communities that found something in her story that resonated with their own experience of the world. The qualities that drew those audiences to her, the resilience in the face of rejection, the ability to keep performing and keep feeling in spite of everything, the sense of someone giving everything they had to an audience while privately carrying something very heavy, were qualities that many people recognized from their own lives. That connection was not manufactured or imposed from outside. It grew organically, rooted in something genuine about who she was and what her story meant. Her daughter, Liza Minnelli, who became one of the most celebrated performers of her own generation, has spoken over the years about what it meant to grow up as Judy Garland's child, and the picture she has painted is one of genuine complexity. The patterns established during Garland's own childhood and professional life did not simply stop when she became a mother. They shaped the environment in which her children grew up, and they left their own marks. What those marks meant for Liza, for Lorna, and for Joey is a story that the world has paid far less attention to than it has paid to their mother, which is perhaps one of the more telling details of the whole account. Judy Garland spent her entire life performing for an audience that could not get enough of her. The people closest to her, the 3 children she left behind at 47, have spent much of their lives in the shadow of that fact. There is a version of Judy Garland's story that ends with her death in June 1969 and the enormous public response that followed it. That version is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because the full picture of what her life actually consisted of, the specific details of what was done to her and the lasting consequences of those things, is considerably more disturbing than the broad outline suggests, and it raises questions that the entertainment industry has never fully answered. The physical management of Garland at MGM went further than is often appreciated. When she was cast as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz at the age of 16, the studio fitted her with special undergarments designed to flatten her developing figure, and the costume itself was chosen in part to minimize and conceal her body. These were not small decisions made without thought. They were deliberate choices that communicated something very specific to a teenage girl, namely that her body as it naturally existed was a problem that needed to be solved before she could be presented to the public. Combined with the dietary restrictions and the remarks being made about her appearance by the most powerful man at the studio, the cumulative effect on her sense of herself was profound and lasting. Beyond the physical, the studio exercised control over her social world in ways that significantly limited her ability to develop any kind of life outside of MGM. Her education took place primarily on the studio lot rather than in a regular school, which meant that her opportunities to form relationships with people outside the entertainment industry were severely restricted. The world she inhabited was almost entirely defined by the studio and the people who worked within it. Whether this was a deliberate strategy or simply a byproduct of the studio's operational priorities is difficult to say with certainty, but the practical effect was the same either way. The studio became the center of her entire existence, and that made the control it exercised over her considerably easier to maintain. The allegations concerning Louis B. Mayer's personal conduct toward Garland represent one of the more troubling aspects of her years at MGM. According to biographical research and materials attributed to an unfinished memoir of Garland's that was discovered decades after her death, Mayer began making inappropriate physical contact with her when she was around 16 years old, around the time of The Wizard of Oz. When she attempted to resist or object, he reportedly responded by appealing to her emotional need for his approval, using the very vulnerability he had helped to deepen as a way of keeping her compliant. Garland also described, in the same attributed materials, being approached inappropriately by other studio executives during her teenage years and facing professional consequences when she declined those advances. These accounts come from biographical research rather than from documents that were produced at the time, and it is important to be clear about that distinction. But they are consistent with what is known about the broader environment she was working in, and they add a dimension to her story that makes the full picture considerably harder to look away from. There is another way of tracing Judy Garland's life that sits alongside the biographical record, and that is through the physical places she lived. The homes she occupied across her lifetime tell their own version of her story, and in some respects they tell it more plainly than anything else. She started in a 2-story white clapboard house on South Pokegama Avenue in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. It is a modest, straightforward building, exactly the kind of home you would expect to find in a solid middle-class neighborhood in the early part of the 20th century. Nothing about it suggests what was coming. The house has since been restored and now serves as the centerpiece of the Judy Garland Museum, where visitors can see the rooms she grew up in before the stage took over everything else. When the family moved to Lancaster, California in the late 1920s, they moved into a larger property that reflected their rising ambitions. Her father converted the basement into a rehearsal space, fitting it with a small stage and mirrors. The house was built around performance in a very literal sense, and that physical fact says something clear about the priorities that governed the household she grew up in. The most symbolically significant of her homes was the property on Stone Canyon Road in Bel Air. Designed by the architect Wallace Neff, and built when Garland was just 16 years old, precisely at the moment she was being cast as Dorothy. Neff was one of the most distinguished residential architects in California at the time, and the house he designed was a deliberate statement of arrival. It spanned approximately 5,500 square feet on a nearly 3-acre lot, with formal reception rooms, 5 bedrooms, and grounds that included a swimming pool. The materials used in its construction, old-growth timber, hand-fired bricks, copper gutters, were chosen to communicate permanence and quality. The property was sold as recently as July 2024 for $11.1 million, which speaks to the enduring value of both the architecture and the address. She later shared a home in the Hollywood Hills with her second husband, Vincente Minnelli, the house where their daughter Liza was born in 1946. It was designed by John Elgin Wolfe, an architect known for a theatrical style that suited his entertainment industry clientele well. Among its more unusual features was a secret bedroom concealed behind a bookcase. After Garland left, the house passed to Sammy Davis Jr., who added a swimming pool while keeping the essential character of the design intact. The last of the significant homes in this sequence was a property in Holmby Hills, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Los Angeles, where she lived from 1952 to 1960. It was the longest she stayed anywhere, and it was here that she raised Liza, Lorna, and Joey through their early years. The house was later demolished, so the full architectural record is incomplete, but period photographs show a substantial colonial revival structure in a neighborhood whose residents included some of the most powerful and successful people in the industry. What is striking about these properties taken together is not their grandeur, though several of them were genuinely impressive. It is the contrast between what they represented from the outside and what was actually happening inside them. Each address was a statement of achievement. Each one was also the location of a life that was, by most accounts, never quite as settled or as secure as the exterior suggested. Garland herself, in various interviews and accounts given by people close to her, consistently described a woman who never fully felt at home, regardless of how impressive the house around her happened to be. That gap between the image and the reality, between what the world saw and what was actually true, was perhaps the defining feature of Judy Garland's entire life. It started on the MGM lot, where the most famous version of her was constructed at considerable cost to the real person underneath, and it never entirely closed. What she left behind was a body of work that continues to move people, a story that refuses to be neatly resolved, and 3 children who grew up inside that gap between the public image and the private truth, inheriting a world shaped entirely by forces that had never particularly had their mother's best interests at heart.